Wook. Dust crunched between my teeth. We were out of ammo, out of time, and out of prayers. The bunker doors buckled under the weight of 1,000 claws. I pressed my forehead against the cold dirt, waiting for the end. Instead, the sky tore open. It rained fire and apes. Ash tasted like old pennies. That was the first thing I realized when I woke up from the concussion blast. Not the agonizing throb in my ribs, and certainly not the screaming outside. Just the metallic, dry grit coating my tongue and the roof of my mouth. I spat, but there was no saliva left. My throat felt like torn paper. Gideon lay 3 paces away. His chest rose in shallow, wet jerks. A dark, shiny puddle crept out from under his cracked ceramic armor, soaking into the porous gray dirt of the trench floor. It smelled sweet, sickly sweet, like overripe fruit left out in the summer sun, mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of cordite and burned hair. I knew I should crawl over to him. The fleet training manuals pounded it into our heads. You always comfort the dying. You hold their hand. You lie to them about the medical ships coming. But I was exhausted. My hands shook so violently I couldn't even close my fingers into a fist to grip my empty rifle. I just watched that black puddle grow, feeling a profound, shameful emptiness welling up inside my gut. I wasn't a hero holding a final grenade. I was just meat waiting to be processed. I was actually relieved he was going first. It meant he wouldn't have to watch me cry when the door gave way. Above us, the sky was the color of a bruised plum, thick with particulate matter and the silhouettes of their harvesters. We called the enemy the Scourge, not because they looked like locusts. They didn't. They were hulking, fleshy nightmares with too many asymmetrical joints, covered in a pale, chalky exoskeleton that deflected our plasma fire like raindrops. We called them the Scourge because they stripped planets down to the bedrock. They didn't want our infrastructure. They wanted our biomass. The reinforced steel barricade above our heads groaned. A heavy, sickening thud vibrated through the soil, traveling up my spine and rattling my teeth and my skull. They were on the roof. A shower of concrete dust drifted down, coating Gideon's pale face. He didn't blink. I couldn't tell if he was already gone or just paralyzed by the shock of his missing lower half. I pulled my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. I had soiled myself an hour ago during the first breach, and the cold wetness was now just an uncomfortable crust against my thighs. The humiliation had faded, replaced entirely by a hollow, animalistic terror. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of their talons on the exterior steel was rhythmic, deliberate. They weren't rushing anymore. They knew we were trapped. They were probing the bunker's weak points, testing the integrity of the welded seams. Every scratch sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. I looked down at my hands. Dirt was packed deep under my fingernails. My knuckles were white, clutching a jagged piece of shrapnel I had picked up without realizing it. What was I going to do with it? Stab a creature the size of a transport truck? I let the metal drop. It hit the dirt with a dull, pathetic thud. Simon. The voice was a wet rasp. I flinched, snapping my gaze to Gideon. His eyes were open now, staring blindly at the crumbling ceiling. Bubbles of pink froth popped at the corners of his mouth. Simon, He choked, coughing up a thick spray of dark fluid. It's cold. I forced my body to move. My knees screamed in protest as I dragged myself across the 3 paces of pulverized rock separating us. I didn't have any medical supplies. I didn't even have a clean rag. I just placed my trembling hand over his uninjured shoulder, feeling the weak, erratic flutter of his pulse beneath the plating. I'm here, Gid, I lied. My voice sounded thin, reedy, like a frightened child. I'm right here. The bunker roof shuddered again. A slow, agonizing groan of rebar giving way under immense, crushing weight. The creature up there knew exactly how much pressure to apply to break the stone, and exactly how long to wait to let the terror marinate before it did. Dust poured down in thick sheets now. A spider web of cracks appeared in the reinforced concrete directly above us. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my forehead against Gideon's shoulder. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to see the pale, chalky limbs breaking through. I didn't want to see the mandibles. The heavy steel doors at the front of the bunker gave a sharp, metallic shriek. The locking mechanism sheared off. A sliver of polluted daylight sliced into the gloom, immediately followed by the stench of ozone and rotting meat. A claw the size of a grown man reached through the gap, blindly hooking around the heavy metal frame. I stopped breathing. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. Just make it fast, I prayed to a god I hadn't spoken to since childhood. Please, just bite my head off. Don't drag me out. Make it fast. The claw pulled. The steel door warped, bending inward like warm wax. Then, the air pressure in the bunker vanished. My eardrums popped with a sickening crack. All the breath was violently sucked from my lungs. The ground beneath me didn't shake, it liquefied. A concussive wave of sheer, unadulterated force slammed into the earth outside, so powerful it threw me backward against the rear wall. The concrete above us didn't cave in. It was blown outward by an ambient shockwave that tore the heavy steel doors completely off their hinges, sending the scourge creature tumbling away into the ash. I lay in the dirt, gasping for air that felt suddenly superheated. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine, drowning out the world. I rolled onto my side, coughing up dust, trying to force my eyes to focus on the ruined doorway. The sky wasn't plumb anymore. It was screaming, blinding orange. Metal shrieked in the distance, a tearing, violent sound of atmosphere being ripped apart by mass. I dragged myself toward the blown-out doorway of the bunker, my muscles acting on blind, stupid instinct. The ringing in my ears faded, replaced by a roar so deafening it rattled the fluid in my chest. I peered over the jagged lip of concrete. The valley below, which had been swarming with thousands of pale, chittering scourge, was gone. In its place was a landscape of smoking craters. They weren't missiles. Missiles explode. These things had hit the ground and stayed there. They looked like iron coffins, brutal, ugly, hexagonal pillars of scarred metal driven deep into the mud. The ablative plating on their exteriors glowed a furious cherry red, radiating waves of blistering heat that I could feel even from 30 yards away. The air smelled of burnt carbon, melting soil, and raw ammonia. One of the coffins sat dead center in the trench line. Its thick metal panels popped and hissed as they cooled. As I watched, paralyzed by the sheer violence of the impact, a line of explosive bolts detonated around the pod's heavy hatch. Clack hiss. The door didn't slide open elegantly. It blew off outward, crushing a surviving scourge drone beneath 2 tons of hyperdense steel. Thick, white vapor poured out of the dark interior, obscuring whatever was inside. I held my breath. The scourge that hadn't been atomized by the impacts were recovering. They shrieked, a terrible bone-scraping sound, and turned their attention to the smoking pods. Hundreds of them began to scuttle forward, their chalky armor clicking, their mandibles snapping at the air. Heavy, mechanical footsteps echoed from within the vapor. The figure that stepped out wasn't tall. Compared to the hulking 12-foot scourge, it was almost squat, bipedal, broad-shouldered. It wore a suit of armor that looked entirely utilitarian, scratched olive-drab plating, exposed hydraulic joints at the knees and elbows, and a sealed helmet with a dark, opaque visor. There were no glowing energy shields, no elegant, sweeping curves of advanced design. It looked like a walking tank. It carried a weapon that was simply a massive block of black metal. A scourge drone lunged at the figure, clearing 20 feet in a single bound, its scythe-like arms raised to bisect the newcomer. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't take an evasive stance. It simply raised the blocky weapon and pulled the trigger. The noise was an assault. It wasn't the clean, high-pitched pew of a plasma rifle. It was a deafening, percussive roar, like a jackhammer firing inside a metal trash can. Thud, 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 cries. A massive tongue of yellow flame erupted from the barrel. I watched in horrified awe as the Scourge drone, the same creature that could take 3 direct hits from our heavy plasma cannons and keep walking, simply disintegrated. The kinetic rounds hit it with so much physical force that the creature was torn into wet, chalky chunks in midair. Pale blood and shattered exoskeleton sprayed across the mud. The bipedal soldier didn't pause to watch it die. They pivoted, the servos in their armor whining sharply, and opened fire on the advancing horde. All across the valley, the other pods were opening, dozens of them, hundreds. It was a slaughter. These strangers didn't fight with the cautious, tactical retreat doctrines of our fleet. They fought with a brutal, terrifying intimacy. They waded directly into the swarms. I saw one of the soldiers run out of ammunition, drop their heavy rifle, and draw a jagged, unpowered metal blade from their thigh. They ducked beneath a sweeping talon, drove the blade up under a Scourge's thorax, and used their armor's hydraulic strength to physically rip the creature's head from its body. It was messy, it was loud, it was deeply, inherently violent. A shadow fell over me. I gasped, scrambling backward as a massive Scourge warrior climbed over the roof of my bunker, its mandibles dripping with thick saliva. It had ignored the new arrivals, hyper-fixated on the easy meat cowering in the hole. It raised a massive, chalky limb, ready to spear me into the dirt. I closed my eyes. A deafening crack shattered the air right beside my head. Something impossibly hot struck my cheek, burning the skin. I cried out, swatting at my face. It was a glowing brass cylinder smoking in the dirt. When I opened my eyes, the Scourge warrior was gone. Its upper half had been reduced to a red mist. The lower half collapsed forward, burying me in twitching, heavy limbs. I thrashed wildly, screaming, trying to push the dead weight off my crushed ribs. The smell of the creature's blood was suffocating copper and rotting fish. I couldn't breathe. I was drowning in the gore. A hand grabbed the collar of my uniform. It wasn't a gentle, reassuring pull. It was a brutal, industrial yank. I was hauled out from under the alien corpse, dragged through the mud, and dumped unceremoniously onto my back outside the bunker. I looked up, coughing violently, my vision swimming. Standing over me was one of the bipedal soldiers. Up close, the armor was incredibly battered. Scorch marks marred the chest plate. Across the shoulder, crude white letters were stenciled into the metal. Miller. The soldier didn't offer a hand to help me up. They didn't ask if I was okay. They just looked down at me through that blank, dark visor. The smell of sweat, old engine grease, and burned powder radiated from the suit. "Stay down." A voice crackled through the suit's external speakers. It was deep, rough, and distinctly weary. "Unless you want to catch a stray." Before I could form a word, Miller turned their back on me, raised that massive smoking gun, and marched directly into the teeth of the swarm. They didn't look like saviors. They looked like butchers. And for the first time in 3 weeks, I felt hope. Blood pooled in the hollows of my collarbone. It wasn't mine. It belonged to the shattered Scourge creature that Miller had turned into paste, and it was beginning to congeal, turning sticky and cold against my skin. I tried to wipe it away with the back of my trembling hand, but I only succeeded in smearing the pale, chalky fluid across my jawline. Gunfire chewed through the ambient roar of the battlefield. It was a rhythmic, overlapping cacophony of deep, percussive thuds. Our fleet plasma rifles made a high, civilized hiss when they discharged, cauterizing wounds instantly. The weapons these humans carried did nothing of the sort. They were engines of kinetic trauma. Every trigger pull was an act of blunt force trauma, tearing chitin, shattering bone, and spraying viscera across the pulverized gray dirt of the trench. I rolled onto my hands and knees, my bruised ribs protesting with a sharp, stabbing ache that stole the breath from my lungs. I needed to move. The bunker was compromised, and the valley was a meat grinder. Heavy, irregular footsteps crunched through the debris behind me. I flinched, instinctively curling into a fetal position, expecting a scourge talon to finally sever my spine. "Get up." The voice was female, filtered through a helmet speaker, but it lacked any trace of the soothing, regulated calm. Our fleet medics were trained to project. It was flat, agitated. A hand clad in scuffed olive-drab composite armor gripped my shoulder and hauled me upright. My legs wobbled like wet paper. I sagged against the ruined concrete wall of the bunker, gasping. The soldier standing in front of me was a few inches shorter than Miller, her armor bearing the stenciled name Hayes across the chest plate. She didn't look at my face. Her dark visor was pointed intently at my chest and abdomen, scanning for fatal trauma. She smelled strongly of burnt cordite, stale chewing gum, and the sharp, chemical bite of cheap antiseptic. "Ribs are cracked, maybe broken," she muttered, seemingly to herself. She reached to her thigh, unclipped a thick black cylinder, and jammed it against the side of my neck before I could flinch. The hiss of compressed air was followed by a sudden, violent burn racing through my veins. It tasted like cold copper at the back of my throat. My heart gave a frantic, stuttering leap, and suddenly, the paralyzing agony in my chest receded to a dull, manageable throb. My vision sharpened. The adrenaline spike was so aggressive it made my teeth vibrate. "Can you hold a weapon?" Hayes demanded. I looked down at my hands. They were caked in mud, blood, and my own filth. I couldn't stop shaking. My rifle was inside, I stammered. My voice cracked, betraying the sheer, pathetic depth of my terror. "It's empty. We ran out of charges 2 hours ago." Hayes made a noise that sounded like a scoff, though the helmet filter distorted it into static. She reached over her shoulder, unslung a compact, brutal-looking firearm, and shoved it against my chest. I scrambled to catch it. It was shockingly heavy, a block of cold, stamped steel and polymer. It felt entirely devoid of elegance. "Point the open end at the bugs. Pull the lever." "Don't shoot my people," she said, already turning away. "Wait," I choked out, desperation clawing at my throat. I didn't want her to leave. I didn't want to be alone with Gideon's bisected corpse and the encroaching horde. Where are the fleet dropships? Where is the evacuation zone? Hayes paused, looking back over her shoulder. The ash falling from the bruised sky collected on her rounded shoulder plating. "There is no evac zone, kid," she said. "We didn't come here to rescue you. We came here to kill them. Now keep up, or bleed out." She broke into a heavy, mechanized jog, moving toward the front line where Miller and the others were forming a loose, sweeping wedge. I looked down at the gun in my hands. It was covered in scratches. The grip was wrapped in frayed black tape, sticky with old sweat. I looked back at the bunker. Gideon was in there. The manual dictated I should retrieve his tags. I should log his time of death. Instead, a fresh wave of cowardly self-preservation washed over me. I turned my back on my dead friend and stumbled after the human, my boots slipping in the mud and gore. The valley floor was unrecognizable. The sleek, defensive fortifications our fleet engineers had spent weeks constructing were entirely obliterated, replaced by a chaotic landscape of smoking drop pods and severed alien limbs. The humans weren't fighting from cover, they were advancing. It defied every logistical combat metric I had ever studied. The Scourge outnumbered them 50-1, yet the humans pushed forward with a relentless, mechanical fury. I trailed behind Hayes' squad, keeping my head down, my breath ragged in my throat. I watched a human soldier, a massive man with a heavy rotary cannon, wade into a cluster of Scourge drones. He didn't bother checking his flanks. He simply held the trigger down, sweeping the barrel in a wide arc. The deafening roar of the weapon shook the ground beneath my feet. Empty brass casings poured from the gun like water, raining into the mud in a glittering, steaming pile. The drones were torn apart, their pale armor completely insufficient against the sheer volume of dense metal ripping through the air. It was a display of absolute, unrefined butchery. There was no art to it, no higher tactical philosophy. It was just an industrial application of death. And as I watched them butcher the creatures that had slaughtered my entire battalion, a dark, shameful knot of satisfaction tightened in my gut. I hated the scourge. But looking at the humans, I realized I was terrified of them, too. Vibrations traveled up through the soles of my boots, distinct from the rhythmic pounding of human artillery. This was deeper. A heavy, rhythmic tremor that made the loose rocks in the dirt dance and clatter against each other. The air pressure shifted. The stench of ozone and cordite was suddenly overwhelmed by a putrid, suffocating wave of sulfur and rotting meat. "Contact front," Hayes barked, her voice cutting through the squad's comm channel, which was bleeding out of external speakers. "Goliath class. Mark and concentrate fire." I peeked around the jagged remains of a crashed fleet transport. Rising from the ash and smoke at the far end of the valley was a scourge siege beast. It wasn't just large, it was an architectural nightmare. It moved on 6 heavily armored legs, its thorax swollen and pulsing with bioluminescent blue veins. Its forelimbs ended in massive, dense hammers of calcified bone, capable of shattering heavy armor plating with a single strike. It towered over the bipedal humans, a mountain of chalky white armor and predatory malice. My heart hammered against my ribs. The fleet manual had one instruction for encountering a siege beast without heavy orbital support: flee. The humans didn't flee. Miller stepped forward from the line, the servos in his battered armor whining. He didn't shout a battle cry. He just raised his left arm and the squad instantly shifted their formation, spreading out into a wide, loose crescent to envelop the beast. The siege beast roared, a sound that bypassed my ears and rattled directly in my sternum. It charged. The ground shook violently. "Hit the joints," Miller ordered, his voice terrifyingly calm. The squad opened fire simultaneously. The noise was apocalyptic. Tracers lit up the ash-choked air, drawing bright red lines of kinetic fury directly into the beast's legs. The scourge monster didn't flinch. Its armor was too thick, deflecting the heavy rounds in showers of sparks and chipped bone. It closed the distance in seconds. One of the massive bone hammers swept low, catching a human soldier on the right flank. The impact was sickening. The heavy, olive-drab armor crumpled like tin foil. The soldier was launched into the air, spinning violently before slamming into the dirt 30 yards away. They didn't get up. A pool of bright, vivid red began to spread beneath them. It was the first time I had seen human blood. It looked shockingly bright against the gray mud. "O'Connor is down," Hayes reported, her voice completely devoid of panic. She didn't break her firing stance. She didn't rush to her fallen comrade. She just kept pulling the trigger. The beast reared back, preparing to bring both hammers down on Miller, who was standing dead center in its path. "Hey, ugly," Miller grunted. He dropped his rifle. It fell into the mud with a heavy splash. With his right hand, he reached to the back of his belt and unhooked a thick, cylindrical charge wrapped in hazard tape. With his left hand, he drew the jagged, unpowered blade from his thigh. He didn't back away. As the beast brought its hammers down, Miller lunged forward. He slid through the mud, the hydraulic joints of his armor screaming as he pushed them past their safety limits. He passed directly beneath the crushing blow, the hammers slamming into the dirt where he had stood a fraction of a second before, sending a shockwave of mud and pulverized rock over me. Miller drove his metal blade upward, burying it deep into the softer, unarmored joint behind the beast's front knee. The creature shrieked, buckling slightly. Using the blade as an anchor, Miller hauled his heavy, armored frame upward, climbing the thrashing limb. The beast snapped its mandibles blindly, trying to dislodge the metal parasite clinging to its leg. Miller ignored the snapping jaws. He reached the pulsing, bioluminescent veins of the thorax, jammed the explosive charge directly into a jagged crevice in the armor, and slammed his fist down on the detonator. He pushed off, falling backward into the mud. "Fire in the hole!" Hayes yelled. I clamped my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut. The explosion didn't just rattle my teeth, it punched all the air out of my lungs again. A wave of intense, searing heat washed over my face, followed by a thick spray of hot, foul-smelling liquid. When I finally opened my eyes, the siege beast was missing its entire upper torso. The headless, ruined carcass swayed for a brief, gravity-defying second before collapsing sideways, hitting the ground with a final, earth-shaking thud. The valley went eerily quiet, save for the crackle of burning alien flesh and the hissing of overheated gun barrels. I slowly stood up, my legs trembling so violently I had to lean against the ruined transport. Miller was sitting in the mud a few yards away. His helmet was cracked, a spider web of fractured glass obscuring the dark visor. He slowly reached up, disengaged the locking seals with a sharp hiss, and pulled the helmet off. He started. I expected a monster. I expected a machine. But the face beneath the armor was just a man. He had grease smeared across his cheek. Deep, exhausted bags hung under his eyes. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under the dented plating. He looked to his right, toward the crumpled, bloody form of O'Connor. For a split second, I saw it. The raw, unprotected grief. The very human pain. His jaw clenched, the muscles working furiously under his skin. Then he blinked, and it was gone. The mask of the predator slid back into place. He picked up his rifle, wiped the mud from the ejection port, and racked the bolt with a sharp, metallic clack. He didn't look at me. He just looked toward the ridge, where the sky was thick with more scourge harvesters. We had waited for saviors. We had prayed for angels of mercy to descend from the stars and lift us from the dirt. Instead, the universe sent Earth. It sent tired, bitter humans in scratched armor, carrying crude weapons of kinetic hate. They weren't here to save us. They were here because they were the apex predators of a hostile galaxy, and the Scourge had finally found something meaner than they were. I gripped the heavy tape-wrapped gun Hayes had given me. I didn't know how to fight like them, but as Miller began to walk toward the next swarm, I realized I didn't have a choice. I stepped over the ruined corpse of the siege beast and followed the butcher into the ash. That was the brutal reality of humanity's arrival. No clean energy weapons, no elegant tactics, just raw, kinetic destruction and the stubborn refusal to die. Simon survived the initial drop, but the war is just getting started. Do you think he can adapt to human warfare? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this visceral dive into HFY Sci-Fi, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on the next chapter.